By the time I reached Pearl's front porch with my overnight bag and a bruise rising on my forearm, my daughter-in-law was already on the phone, calling people to come celebrate. I could hear her through the open window as I walked down the street. "She finally left," she said. "Come tonight. We're having people over." What she didn't know was that the deed to that house was folded in the bottom of my bag, and I still had one phone call left to make. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started. Not that morning, but 18 months ago when I made the mistake of saying yes. I am 66 years old. I've lived in the same house on Wren Hollow Road for 31 years. My husband Henry and I bought it in 1993, the year our son Miles started second grade. It was a 3-bedroom colonial with a leaky basement and a backyard full of overgrown azaleas, and I loved it the moment I walked through the door. We spent the next 10 years fixing it up. Henry refinished the hardwood floors himself, working on his hands and knees every weekend for 2 months straight. I planted the garden. I repainted every room twice until I got the colors right. When we made our last mortgage payment, Henry took me to dinner to celebrate. Just the two of us, and he ordered champagne, which he almost never did, and he said, "Viola, this house is yours forever. Nobody can take it from you." He died 14 months later. Heart attack, quick and without warning, the way the cruelest things always are. I spent 2 years learning how to be alone. Then I spent another 7 years making a life out of it. I retired from the public library where I'd worked for 23 years. I joined a book club. I kept my garden. I took a watercolor class on Thursdays. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine, and I had worked hard to make peace with it. My son Miles is 35. He is a quiet man who married a loud woman, and for a long time I told myself that opposites attract, that his wife Gemma's energy was good for him, that what I felt in my chest whenever she spoke wasn't a warning but just old-fashioned mother-in-law's nerves. I was wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. 18 months ago, Miles called me on a Sunday evening. He sounded tired. He said Gemma had been let go from her marketing job, that their apartment lease was up at the end of the month, and that they'd been looking at their options. He said it would just be for a few months. He said they'd cover a portion of the utilities. He said I wouldn't even notice they were there. I said yes, of course I said he is my son. They moved in on a Saturday with 2 trailer loads and a confidence I should have recognized sooner. Gemma walked through the house. That first afternoon, the way someone walks through a house they're about to redecorate. Slowly, touching things, tilting her head. I told myself she was just getting her bearings. The first few weeks weren't bad. Miles helped in the yard. Gemma cooked dinner a few times, and she was a good cook, I'll give her that. Little Ivy, who was 5 at the time, would sit in the garden with me while I watered my roses and ask what every flower was called. She had this serious way of memorizing things, repeating each name back to me twice. Snapdragon. Snap. Salvia. Salvia. I fell in love with that child the moment I met her, and that feeling never changed. But things began to shift, small at first. Gemma reorganized my kitchen cabinets one afternoon while I was out. She said she'd done it, so things were easier to find. My cast iron skillet ended up under the sink. My good mixing bowls were replaced on the counter by a set of stainless steel canisters she'd brought from their apartment. When I mentioned that I'd always kept things a certain way, she gave me a bright, patient smile, the kind you give a child who doesn't understand, and said, "I know, but this is more functional." I let it go. I shouldn't have, but I told myself it was her home too, for now, and small battles weren't worth the damage. Then she asked for the master bedroom. She came to me 6 weeks after they moved in. Miles wasn't home. Gemma sat across from me at my kitchen table with Ivy on her lap and said the guest room was too small for the 3 of them, that Ivy needed space to sleep and play, that it was really about the child's well-being. She said it so reasonably that I sat there nodding before I realized what I'd agreed to. I moved into the guest room. It faces the back of the house, and in winter the heating vent doesn't reach it properly. I put Henry's old quilt on the bed and told myself it was fine. Within a week, Gemma had repainted the master bedroom. She didn't ask. She just came home with cans of a gray-green paint and had Miles tape the trim one evening, and by morning my room, the room Henry and I had shared for 22 years, was a color that felt nothing like us. She threw out my bedside table. It was falling apart, she said. It wasn't. I am not a person who makes scenes. I was raised by a woman who believed that dignity was the one thing nobody could take from you unless you handed it over, and I carried that belief like a stone in my pocket my whole life. So I said things quietly, once, and when I was ignored, I went back to my room and sat with it. Miles saw some of it. I know he did. But he came home tired every night, and Gemma had his plate on the table and his beer in the refrigerator, and whatever small rebellion he might have been capable of never surfaced. Once I heard her tell him, through their closed bedroom door, that I was resistant to change, as if what I was resisting was change, and not the slow removal of my own life from my own home. The electric bill tripled. When I brought it up, Miles said he'd cover it next month. He never did. I started buying my own groceries and keeping them in a small refrigerator I moved into my room. I know how that sounds, but it was easier than watching my food disappear. Gemma's friends came over on weekends. They stayed late and sat in my living room without inviting me to join them. Once I came out for a glass of water, and one of them looked at me with genuine surprise, as if she hadn't known anyone else lived there. I went back to my room. I watched Ivy almost every afternoon. Gemma said she needed time to job search, which I understood. But the job search seemed to involve a great deal of shopping and lunch dates, and after a while I stopped expecting it to lead anywhere. Ivy didn't mind. She and I built a birdhouse in the garage. We read through the library's entire picture book collection twice over. She started calling me Grandma Vi, which was new. Nobody had ever called me that, and I thought maybe that name was the best thing I'd been called in years. It was 4 months ago that I found the letter. I was looking for a water bill I thought I'd misplaced. I checked the kitchen junk drawer, which Gemma had reorganized along with everything else, and there it was among old takeout menus and expired coupons. An envelope addressed to my home from Callaway Realty Group, already opened. Inside was a letter addressed to Mrs. Gemma Harlow, thanking her for her inquiry regarding the property at 412 Wren Hollow Road, and providing a preliminary market valuation of $387,000. I stood at my kitchen counter and read that letter 3 times. They were planning to sell my house. I put the letter back exactly where I'd found it. My hands were steady. Inside I felt something cold, not the cold of fear, but the cold of a decision being made. That evening I called my friend Pearl. We've been friends since our children were in elementary school together. She's 70 now, still sharp as anyone I know, and she lives 4 streets over. I didn't tell her everything on the phone, I just said I needed to talk. She said, "Come right now." I sat in Pearl's kitchen until midnight. I showed her the photo I'd quietly taken of the letter on my phone. I told her about the reorganized cabinets and the repainted bedroom and the electric bills and all of it, and Pearl listened with her hands folded on the table and her expression hardening as I went on. "Viola," she said when I finished, "you know my daughter's husband is an attorney." I did know that, I'd half forgotten. "Estate law mostly," she said, "but I want you to call him this week." I said I would, and I meant to, but things accelerated faster than I expected. 2 weeks after I found that letter, Miles sat down across from me at breakfast. Gemma wasn't in the room, which I should have noted, and put a folder of papers on the table. He said he'd talk to a lawyer. He said it would be smart, just basic estate planning if I added his name to the deed as a co-owner. So if anything ever happens to you, Mom, we don't have to deal with probate. It's easier for everyone. He said it gently. He said it like he was doing me a favor. I looked at the papers. I looked at my son. I thought about the word easier and who it was easier for. "I'm not signing anything," I said. His face changed. Not dramatically. Miles isn't a dramatic person. It was more like something went flat. "You're not even going to read them?" "I don't need to read them. This house is in my name. It stays that way." He stood up. He picked up the folder. Something in his posture shifted. Something I'd never let myself see in him before, or maybe never looked for. "We've been here a year and a half," he said. "We've put money into this place. We've improved it." "You repainted one room without asking me," I said. "That's not an investment." He left without answering. I heard him talking to Gemma in the hallway, too low to make out. What happened 3 days later is the part I still find hardest to tell. I was in the kitchen making lunch. Miles was home. He'd said something about a flexible day, and he and Gemma had been arguing in the living room about something I wasn't paying attention to. I was making a sandwich. Then he came into the kitchen and started in again about the deed, and I said what I'd said before, and this time he didn't stay flat. He raised his voice. He said I was paranoid and selfish, and that everything they'd done for this house entitled them to some security. He said I was going to die and leave a legal mess, and he was only trying to think ahead. He said it the way you say something you've held too long. Fast and mean and past thinking. I told him to lower his voice. He put his hand on my shoulder and shoved me away from the counter. It wasn't hard the way a blow from a stranger is hard, but it was hard enough. I hit my forearm on the refrigerator door handle and lost my balance and went down on one knee on the kitchen floor, and while I was kneeling there, I heard my granddaughter in the hallway. "Daddy?" Ivy's voice was small and confused and scared. Gemma came in. She looked at me on the floor. She looked at Miles. "She slipped," she said, flat and quick, like she'd already prepared it. Miles didn't help me up. He walked out to the back porch. I got myself up off the floor. I went to my room. I pulled down Henry's old canvas bag from the top shelf of my closet, olive green from his fishing trips, and I packed what I'd need, my medications, a change of clothes, my reading glasses, and the house deed from the fireproof box under my bed, along with all the other documents I'd quietly made copies of over the previous weeks, folded inside a plastic sleeve. Before I left, I looked in on Ivy. She was in her room with the door half open, sitting on her bed, picking at a loose thread on her comforter. She looked up. "Grandma Vi," she said, "are you going somewhere?" "Just for a little while, sweetheart." She slid off the bed and hugged me around the middle. She was so small. I held the back of her head and breathed in the strawberry smell of her shampoo and told myself, "Not yet. Don't cry yet. Not in front of her." "I'll be back," I told her. "I promise." She looked up at me with those serious eyes. She knew I meant it differently than I was saying it. I walked through the living room. Gemma was on the couch with her phone. She didn't look up. I walked out the front door and I went to Pearl's house. Pearl opened the door before I even knocked. She'd seen me coming up the walk. She took one look at my face and the bag on my shoulder and pulled me inside without a word. I spent that night in her guest room. I told myself I just needed to get through the night, that in the morning things would be clearer. The next afternoon, Pearl came in from outside with her phone in her hand and a look on her face I hadn't seen before. "Viola," she said, "you need to see this." She handed me the phone. Her daughter had sent a string of photographs. They were of my house. My house from the outside and through the front window. Cars lined the block. People stood on my front porch with drinks. Through the living room window I could see balloons, pink and silver, and a banner I could barely read. Pearl scrolled to a clearer shot. The banner said, "Welcome home." A housewarming party. In my house, less than 24 hours after my son had put me on the floor. There was also a video. Pearl's daughter had recorded it through the window. I could hear Gemma's voice distinctly. She has one of those voices that carries across a room, across a yard, apparently across the street. She was saying, "We've been wanting to do this for a while. This is really our home now. We just needed some time to make it official." Someone laughed. Glasses clinked. I watched the video twice. Then I set Pearl's phone on the table and said, "Call your daughter's husband." His name was Duncan. Pearl called him, and he was at her house within the hour, briefcase and all, still in his work clothes. He sat at the same kitchen table I'd sat at the night before, and I laid out everything I had. The original deed in my name, the realtor's letter, copies of electric bills going back 18 months showing my name as the sole account holder, and the bruise on my forearm that Pearl had photographed that morning. Duncan asked his questions carefully and without hurry. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The realtor contact is the piece that makes this more than a family dispute. Your daughter-in-law was soliciting sales information on property she has no legal ownership of. That's fraud, combined with documented physical assault and the fact that you are the sole title holder and have been effectively forced from your own home. I can file for an emergency protective order and emergency eviction today." "Today," I said. "Signed and in motion by tonight." I want to say something here that I've thought about a great deal since then, because I know what people wonder. Why did it take so long? Why did I let it go as far as it went? And I understand the question, because I've asked it of myself. Part of the answer is that it happens by degrees. Each thing is only slightly worse than the one before, And by the time you've reached the bad place, you've already adjusted to everything leading up to it. And he is my son. I carried him. I sat up with him when he was sick. I drove him to every practice and concert and appointment for 18 years. That doesn't disappear because it should. And there is also a practical reality, which Duncan explained to me that evening, and which I wish someone had explained to me a year ago, that once a person has lived in a residence for more than 30 days, even without any lease, they have tenant rights. I couldn't simply tell them to leave. I would have had to go through a formal eviction process that could take months. The fraud changed that. It gave us grounds for an emergency order that moved the timeline entirely. Duncan made calls. He filed papers. At 6:30 that evening, we drove to my house in 2 cars, his and Pearl's, and a police cruiser met us a block away. I sat in Pearl's passenger seat and watched Officer Torres and her partner walk up to my front door. My front door. The one Henry hung himself the summer the old one warped. They could hear the party from the street. Officer Torres knocked 3 times. The music dropped. Footsteps. The door opened, and it was Gemma in a wrap dress with a glass of wine, and her face did something I had never seen it do before. It went from bright and social to blank in the space of a second. "Good evening," Officer Torres said. "We have a court order. Please step aside." "What?" Gemma's voice went high. "What court order? This is our home." Duncan stepped forward and handed her the papers. "It isn't," he said. "The property at this address belongs solely to Viola Maddox. This is an emergency eviction order, signed and authorized. You have 30 minutes to gather essential belongings." I got out of Pearl's car. I walked up the front path. I don't know what I looked like to the party guests who were crowding the hallway to see what was happening. I know what I felt. I felt like the house recognized me walking back toward it. I know how that sounds. I don't care. Miles was near the back, still holding a pair of grilling tongs, his face cycling through surprise and anger, and something that might have been shame if he'd been capable of it just then. "Mom," he said it like an accusation. "You pushed me to the floor," I said, "in front of your daughter." He didn't answer that. Gemma was crying, the performing kind, meant for an audience, and she had one. 30 people in my living room. I recognized some of them. One woman caught my eye and then looked quickly away. "We live here," Gemma was telling Officer Torres. "We've improved this property. We have rights here." "Ma'am," Torres said, "the order is signed. Please gather what you need." I watched Gemma look at the guests. Look at Miles. Look at me. I watched the exact moment she understood that this particular performance wasn't going to work. The guests filed out in 1s and 2s, quiet and quick, the way people leave when they realize they've wandered into something private and serious. In 20 minutes, my living room held nothing but the pink and silver balloons and the Welcome Home banner someone had strung over my fireplace. Then I heard a voice at the top of the stairs. "Grandma Vi." Ivy was in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes, looking down through the banister. She'd been put to bed before the party started. She saw me and said my name again, clearer, and started coming down the stairs. I met her at the bottom. I crouched to her level. She put both arms around my neck and I held her, and she was warm and small and smelled like sleep, and I kept it together because she needed me to. "Are you staying?" she whispered. "I'm staying," I told her. The social worker, who had come with the officers at Duncan's arrangement, stepped forward gently and spoke to Ivy while I stood up. Miles and Gemma packed downstairs. I didn't watch them go. I took my granddaughter back upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and told her a made-up story about a girl who could talk to birds, one of the running series we'd started months ago, and I kept my voice even all the way through. When she was asleep, I went back downstairs. The house was quiet. Balloons drifted near the ceiling. There was food on my dining table. Platters Gemma had bought, cheese and crackers and little sandwiches with toothpicks in them. There were empty glasses on my furniture without coasters. There were strangers' shoes by the door. I got a trash bag and I started cleaning. It was past 10 at night, and I was 66 years old, and I'd had the worst day I could remember since the day I lost Henry, and I cleaned my house because it was mine to clean, and because there was something necessary about doing it with my own hands. I needed to touch every surface and put everything back. I was there until midnight. Then I changed the locks. Duncan had walked me through it, new hardware in hand, and I went to my bedroom, and made up the bed with my own sheets that had been boxed in the closet for 18 months. I lay down. I slept. The months since have been quieter than I expected and fuller. The fraud case is still working through the system. Duncan says it's solid. The realtor confirmed in writing that Gemma had contacted them without my knowledge, implying shared ownership of a property she had no claim to. Miles's attorney reached out once about a settlement. I told Duncan I wanted the process to run its course. Ivy is still with me. Family court arranged the temporary custody while her parents stabilized elsewhere. They're renting a small apartment now, from what I understand, and I enrolled her in the school 4 blocks over. Every morning I walk her there, and every afternoon I pick her up, and she tells me everything that happened, in detail, in order, because she is that kind of child. I listen to every word. Pearl and I have coffee every Thursday. She brings scones from the bakery on Elm. We sit at my kitchen table, everything where I put it, finally, and we talk about books and gardens and nothing important, and I am grateful for every ordinary minute of it. My son called once, about 6 weeks after. He left a voicemail. He said he was sorry. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said he loved me. I listened to it twice. I have not called back. I'm not sure yet if I will. Some doors, once you understand what was behind them, take a long time to open again. Maybe they shouldn't. What I know is this. Henry was right all those years ago over the champagne we almost never bought. This house is mine. Nobody can take it from me. Not as long as I understand what I understand now. That the deed in the fireproof box is worth fighting for. That a woman alone is not a woman without resources. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is get yourself up off the kitchen floor. Pick up your bag and make one phone call. Last week, Ivy and I were in the garden together, and she was going through the winter roses the way she does, naming each one twice, and she stopped and looked up at me with those serious eyes. "Grandma V," she said, "are you happy?" I told her yes. She said, "Good," the way children say things when they mean them completely, without complication, and turned back to her flowers. I am 66 years old. I have my house, my garden, my friend Pearl, and this serious rose-naming child who showed up in my life and decided to stay. I have had better years, by some measures, but I have not, in a very long time, had a year that felt more completely like mine.